I want to build some context for how we're going to look into this chapter today. In Luke 7, there is a prostitute woman, and we find her kneeling before Jesus, and she's weeping. She's full of faith and kissing the feet of the Savior. Now, they're at the house of a Pharisee, and so, of course, they object to this, and Jesus begins to tell them a parable. Speaking to Simon, Jesus says this: a certain moneylender had two debtors. One owed 500 denarii and the other 50. When they could not pay, he canceled the debt of both. Now, which of them will love him more? And Simon answered, the one, I suppose, for whom he canceled the larger debt. The scriptures, as we are all well aware, are filled with many glorious things that we as Christians love and things that we must cling to, really. The Bible is filled with pictures of God's mercy and love, filled with hope. It shows us that Christ, through his life and death, has made us one with God by his sacrifice on a cross. And so the Bible is filled to the brim with these beautiful reminders, these glorious things that we love. But sometimes, as Scripture leads us into it, it's to our great benefit that we spend some time studying and dwelling on the alternative view presented to us in Scripture. Namely, what it means to reject Christ and come under God's awful law, awful judgment. Now, as unpleasant as that sounds to kind of dwell on such a thing, the purpose of this sermon is not to drive us to some kind of despair or to crush us under the weight of our sin, to kind of bring us to a point where we're weeping and we don't understand our salvation or anything like that. Rather, difficult passages like this make us cherish our forgiveness all the more. It makes us love Christ more intensely. It should make us like the prostitute in Luke chapter 7 who realized that her sin was great, and so she rushed to the feet of the one who would save her. So today, as we enter into 1 Samuel chapter 8, we do enter into one of these hard to deal with chapters. It's I think, one of the darkest chapters in all of Scripture. It's right up there with Judas walking out into the dark after the final supper. And because of that, it's with some difficulty that we grapple with it. But if we deal with this correctly, that is, we deal with this passage with a correct mindset of our own sin against the backdrop of the cross, then such passages, I think, serve to drive us to Christ. So, looking now into the passage, well, first let's do this. Let's talk about last month. Peter, he preached from us in chapter 27 and into the first couple of verses of chapter 28. David, in disobedience and mistrust for God, has fled from Saul to the Philistines. And the first few verses of chapter 8 show us that David is in a real dilemma. In fleeing to the Philistines, David and his men have been recruited into the service of the Philistines, conducting raids on their behalf. And they've done such a good job that we find David has been promoted. And so this is where the dilemma comes in. It's very clear in the first verse of chapter 28, and it reads this: in those days the Philistines gathered their forces for war to fight against Israel. And Achish said to David, understand that you and your men are to go out with me in the army. And so David is in this very difficult situation. And the story, I think, has us curious on how David might get out of this mess that he is in. But the writer of 1 Samuel abruptly stops us there and then shares with us instead of what is going on with Saul. What is so important with Saul that we must leave the dilemmas of David to catch up with him? Saul, as you remember, back in chapter 15, has been told by the prophet Samuel that the Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from him. And from that moment on, Saul has been in direct disobedience to God. Instead of stepping away from the throne in obedience, Saul has spent his entire life trying to secure what the Lord has torn away from him. In other words, Saul is a man who has lived his life rejecting God. And here in chapter 28, we meet up with this kind of final culmination of that rejection. This chapter gives us some of the closing hours of a man who has lived his life rejecting God, rejecting his commandments. And so that's kind of the premise of the chapter. And so today we're going to look at those last intimate moments in the dealings with Saul. And we're going to pull out 3 points of applications, all of them related to Saul's rejection. So our first point is going to be in verses 3 through 6. Point 1 is the man who rejects God will be rejected by God. Let's read 3 through 6 together. Now Samuel had died, and all Israel had mourned for him and buried him in Ramah, his own city. And Saul put out the mediums and the necromancers out of the land. The Philistines assembled and came and encamped at Shunem. And Saul gathered all Israel, and they escaped to Gilboa. When Saul saw that the armies of the Philistines, he was afraid, and his heart trembled greatly. And when Saul inquired of the Lord did not answer him, either by dreams, or by Urim, or by prophets. So in these first few verses, we see that Saul has been backed into a pretty bad corner, and he sits in this corner all alone. The Philistines have amassed an army, and it says that they're camping outside of a city named Shunem. They have amassed a major army here. Now, the city of Shunem, by the way, is not a border town. The Philistines have gathered their armies deep within the borders of Israel. So Saul and the nation of Israel find themselves again being sieged by the threat of the Philistines. On top of that, while David isn't part of our text today, his absence is clearly felt. For the last several chapters, Saul has been chasing David around, trying to kill him. But remember that before this, it was at the hands of David that Israel had success against their enemies. It was David who Saul had trusted and appointed him over the armies of Israel. It was David who stood against the Philistine giant. But having driven David away, he is now without him, the man who he once trusted to stand against the enemies of Israel. We're also reminded for a second time that Samuel has died. It was just 4 chapters ago that the writer of 1 Samuel announced to us his death. But to press upon us the impact of Samuel's death, we're again reminded here. As with David, there was a time when this would have been the man that Saul turned to and Israel in their time of need. And so we're reminded of Samuel's death because it weighs heavily on Saul. So Saul is without David, he's without Samuel, his former companions. The Philistines have amassed their armies, and he is in a bad situation. So what does he do? Well, something neat considering it's Saul. Verse 6 tells us that Saul began to inquire of the Lord. He began to seek him out. For the first recorded time in his life, Saul decides he wants to seek out the Lord. In fact, he seems to be looking everywhere for him. He's hoping to hear from the Lord in a dream, but God doesn't come in a dream. He seeks God by way of Urim, which are these rocks by which somehow God spoke to the prophets. We don't know exactly how it worked. But he doesn't hear from God that way either. He goes to the prophets, but the prophets say they have no word from the Lord for him. God has fallen silent on Saul's life. Why isn't the Lord speaking to Saul? There's a variety of reasons that God can go silent. I think if I asked every faithful, God-loving Christian here, I know we would all have moments in our lives where God feels like he's just kind of far away. Maybe he's just a little bit silent. But for that person, when God feels away, it kind of sends us into a God-seeking frenzy, right? We desperately seek out for him. And so the Lord's silence can actually work to draw one closer to him. God can go quiet, and it can mean the strengthening of the Christian. Many of us, I think, in here can testify to that feeling. But that's not what is going on here. Other times, when someone realizes that God has fallen silent, the situation is much different. A little bit of dissecting of what's going on in their life, and you would find that there's not a whisper of prayer. Sin is being harbored and protected. There's no confession, no repentance, no true love for God. And then something happens in their life and they seek him and he doesn't answer and they kind of bemoan his silence. Why isn't God speaking to me? Why isn't he giving me a word? The issue here is that God has spoken to them, but they have rejected his counsel. And so the Lord has nothing left to say. This is what's going on with Saul in the extreme. He has shown a repeated pattern of disobedience in his life. God, by the way of the prophet Samuel, has been told that the kingdom has been torn from him, and instead of repenting, Saul has rejected that message and has instead sought to secure the throne by any means necessary. And so as a result of Saul rejecting God, God has nothing to say to Saul. Proverbs chapter 1 perfectly sums up this situation. Verses 24 through 29 say this: "Because I have called and you have refused to listen, have stretched out my hand and no one has heeded, because you have ignored all my counsel and would have none of my reproof, I will laugh at your calamity. I will mock when terror strikes you. When terror strikes you like a storm and your calamity comes like a whirlwind, when distress and anguish come upon you, then they will call upon me, but I will not answer. They will seek me diligently, but will not find me, because they have hated and did not choose the fear of the Lord." So Saul's life provides for us here a hard-to-hear lesson. If we seek out to live a life of rebellion apart from God and his counsel, then we seek out to live a life that will ultimately be rejected by God. I was reminded reading one commentator of what the writer of Hebrews says. 3 times in the book of Hebrews it says this: "Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts." The plea there is to not reject God, his word, do not reject his counsel. But Saul, in his rejection, has hardened his heart. He's no longer sensitive to the teachings and to the reproof of the Lord. Having received nothing but silence from God, in the next section, we see Saul tries to circumvent God. And this brings us to our second point in verses 7 through 19. The man who rejects God believes he doesn't need God. Starting in verse 7, it says this: "Then Saul said to his servants, 'Seek out for me a woman who is a medium, that I may go to her and inquire of her.' And his servant said to him, 'Behold, there is a medium at Endor.' So Saul disguised himself and put on other garments and went, he and 2 men with him. And they came to the woman by night. And he said, 'Divine for me a spirit, and bring up for me whomever I shall name to you.' The woman said to him, 'Surely you know that Saul has done, how he has cut off the mediums and the necromancers from the land. Why then are you laying a trap for my life to bring me about my death?' But Saul swore to her by the Lord, 'As the Lord lives, no punishment shall come upon you for this thing.' Then the woman said, 'Whom shall I bring up for you?' He said, 'Bring up Samuel.' When the woman saw Samuel, she cried out with a loud voice. And the woman said to Saul, "Why have you deceived me? You are Saul." The king said to her, "Do not be afraid. What do you see?" And the woman said to Saul, I see a God coming up from the earth." He said to her, "What is his appearance?" And she said, "An old man is coming up, and he is wrapped in a robe." And Saul knew that it was Samuel, and he bowed his face to the ground and paid homage. Then Samuel said to Saul, "Why have you disturbed me by bringing me up?" Saul answered, "I am in great distress, for the Philistines are warring against me, and God has turned away from me and answers me no more, either by prophets or by dreams. Therefore I have summoned you to tell me what I shall do." And Samuel said, "Why do you ask me, since the Lord has turned from you and become your enemy? The Lord has done to you as he spoke by me, for the Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hand and given it to your neighbor David. Because you did not obey the voice of the Lord, it did not carry out his fierce wrath against Amalek. Therefore, the Lord has done this thing to you this day. Moreover, the Lord will give you and Israel also into the hands of the Philistines. And tomorrow you and your sons shall be with me. The Lord will give the army of Israel also into the hands of the Philistines." Now, I didn't touch on something up in verse 3 because I wanted to reserve it for here. But in verse 7, you see here that Saul is attempting to find answers. And so what he decides on is he wants to seek out counsel from a medium. But you noticed probably up in verse 3 that it said that it was Saul who had put out the mediums and the necromancers of the land. This was a good thing he did. It's in accordance with God's law. Leviticus 19 and 20 specifically forbid such practices, and they have no place among God's people. But verse 3 is interesting because it's a little reminder that recalls us back to a time when Saul was doing some good. It's easy to forget, I think, in following his downfall, that Saul's reign began with promise. He conquered the Amalekites. He even showed mercy to those who had been mocking him. There was a time when he was conducting himself faithfully as a king. So when you look at verse 3 and verse 7 side by side, it kind of bridges this long gap on both ends of Saul's life to show us just how far we've come. There was a time, according to verse 3, where Saul sought to have the mediums disbarred from the nation of Israel. There was a time where this wasn't going to be tolerated because God's law forbids it. But, as we see here in verse 7, against his own rule and previous judgment, he now seeks what he previously put out. You see, Saul is a changed man. Saul has piece by piece, through the book of 1 Samuel, been shedding away the king that he was supposed to be until we finally arrive here at chapter 28, where we see he's just a hollowed out shell of his former self. But we get these little reminders, and I think they're interesting because they're little reminders of what sin has cost Saul. He's been robbed of his humanity. His conscience has been seared. The great purpose that he served as king for God's people has been distilled down into this kind of self-preservation. And so the man who once had counsel with the Lord and walked alongside Samuel now seeks counsel from the occult, from the wicked and the perverse. And his mindset is this: if God won't help me, then I'll help myself by whatever means necessary, even if that means forsaking my own judgments. So Saul seeks out a medium woman here. Interestingly, they don't have to seek long. His servants seem to know exactly where to find this woman. And I think the fact that they don't have to hunt for one maybe speaks to the state of Israel at this point. Paganism has, under Saul's reign, began to creep back into the nation of Israel. Israel, you remember, wanted a king to be like the nations, and they certainly have one now. And the ramifications of that are beginning to set in. And so these things are creeping back into the nation. And so the servants know where one is, and so by secret, by night, they head out. Of course it's by secret and by night. We know that that's how sin operates, right? These things rarely make it out into the daylight. And when Saul arrives at the home of the medium, he asks her to summon up a spirit. We see she resists at first, fearing this might be one of Saul's sting operations, I guess. And she doesn't want to be caught. But after some assurances here from Saul, she finally agrees. Now, we have zero information about what ritual she might have conducted to bring about something like this, but all we know really is that after a while, she sees Samuel coming up, and she is terrified. She is fearful. Interesting, and again, not a whole lot of explanation, but at the same time, she recognizes Samuel. She also recognizes Saul. I think it's interesting what's happening here. She obviously has never seen anything like this before. And I don't know if this was a falsified occult woman who kind of practiced like what we see the guys on TV where they start saying, ma, and someone says, oh, my mom. You know, we've seen the ridiculousness there. But or if this is something legit and she kind of does summon up something. I don't know. Either way, she hasn't seen something like this. She hasn't seen a righteous man appear. That's interesting to her. Now, I've been told preaching 2-hour sermons on Sunday evening isn't wise, so we're not going to have time to dissect every little thing here. But what I want to hone in on here is Samuel's response to Saul, because this is the main point of the passage here. This is what we're seeking. So we can be distracted by what's going on with the occult here and all the questions that we don't have answers to, but that's not the purpose of God's word. Those answers aren't given to us for a reason. And so if you're wondering what the answers to some of these things are, I don't know, okay? But what is important here is Samuel's response to Saul. Saul asks Samuel in verse 15, I am in great distress, for the Philistines are warring against me, and God has turned away from me and answers me no more, either by prophets or dreams. Therefore, I have summoned you to tell me what I shall do. So he's asking Samuel what he should do. Now, I think the reality here is Saul knows what he should do. He is the king of Israel. You go up against the armies of the Philistines. That's what you do. But really, you know how people pad what they really want? I think that's what he's doing, because what he's wanting actually is some reassurances from Samuel that he's going to be okay. But the answer here is not what Saul wanted to hear. Again, Saul has spent his entire life circumventing, bypassing God, doing what he wants. And after 40 years of doing this, he finds out that the Lord's message through the prophet Samuel has not changed. He's spent all these years clinging to what God has removed, and he's gone to some extreme measures to do so. He's embarrassed himself. He's chased David across the countryside, trying to kill the king. He slaughtered the priesthood of Nob, only to find that every measure he has taken has been taken in vain. God's word and his judgment stands. And so we get that scathing answer from Samuel there in verse 17. The Lord has done to you as he spoke by me, for the Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hand and given it to your neighbor David. That's an almost word for word of what Samuel said back in chapter 15. The message hasn't bent or moved at all. It's exactly the same. Now, we know not much has really changed today. It's easy to look at the weird circumstances and grab onto that, but really, Saul is just another man when you dissect this. And so many people today have expended their entire lives believing that they don't need God, believing that they can circumvent him. Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. But nonetheless, countless people have died with nothing but filthy rags to their name. Christ teaches us that joy and satisfaction are found in him alone, but the world seeks to circumvent that and satisfy their desires through flesh. False teachers and false doctrines pop up like weeds, teaching people they can sidestep certain teachings of Scripture. But in the end, it's always found out that what God has commanded, what God has said, everything from promises to judgment, stand. They don't change. One last note before we move on to our last point. I want to point out to you verse 19. This is kind of an important point. Logan talked about the thread of the shepherd that runs through scriptures this morning, and I kind of want to latch onto that thread for just a second. As we work through the book of 1 Samuel, much of our focus, we know, is on Samuel, on Saul and David, and how the Lord is dealing with their lives. But something we need to not lose sight of is the fact that in dealing with these three men, we're also dealing with all of Israel, because these men are supposed to be the shepherds of Israel. And so verse 19 states something here. It says here that Saul is not the only one who's going to be given over to the Philistines, but all of Israel and their armies will be turned over as well. This, I think, is a pretty clear indication that Israel at the moment is really without a shepherd. Samuel is dead. Saul's kingship is defunct, and he's only serving his own needs. And David, in his mistrust of the Lord, he's hanging out with the Philistines, feeding the wolf instead of tending to the sheep. So there's no shepherd rod in Israel right now. No rod of protection or discipline or guidance. The result being that the nation has fallen into a state of paganism, and they will now be handed over as punishment to the Philistines. It's a pretty distressing thing we see here. People without a shepherd. It's something that Jesus latched onto often in the Testament, right? He would see the crowds, and one of the first things he would say is, these people are like scattered sheep without a shepherd. It causes great damage, great damage. Saul is part of that damage. So Saul has heard this message here from Samuel. God hasn't changed his mind. Tomorrow he will be dead, and all of Israel will be handed over with him. And so this brings us into point number 3. Those who reject God will have no hope and no joy. Beginning in verse 20, then Saul fell at once, full length on the ground, filled with fear because of the words of Samuel, and there was no strength in him, for he had eaten nothing all day and all night. And the woman came to Saul, and when she saw that he was terrified, she said to him, behold, your servant has obeyed you. I have taken my life in my hands and listened to what you have said to me. Now therefore you also obey your servant. Let me set a morsel of bread before you and eat, that you may have strength when you go on your way. He refused and said, I will not eat. But his servants, together with the woman, urged him, and he listened to their words. So he arose from the earth, and he sat on the bed. Now the woman had a fattened calf in the house, and she quickly killed it. And she took flour and kneaded it, and baked unleavened bread of it. And she put it before Saul and his servants, and they ate. Then they rose and went away that night. So without a doubt, the darkest day of Saul's life. Here he is, he's dressed in this ridiculous disguise at the house of a medium, inquiring to seek of her. He does manage to speak to Samuel, but the prophet tells him a message that he doesn't want to hear. Saul has placed his hopes in the hands of a medium, his servants, and Samuel. But in these things, there is no hope to be found. As a result, we see that Saul fell at once full length to the ground. That's just a fun way of saying he totally collapsed. He is in shock. He's filled with fear. The servant and the medium console him and try to get him to eat. And at first he refuses, but after a little bit, they manage to get him up, and the medium starts to prepare a meal here. It says she slaughtered a fattened calf and prepared some unleavened bread. I was thinking about this scene here and the fattened calf, and it's an interesting picture. It reminded me of my dad's funeral a few months ago. My parents' church was gracious enough afterwards to prepare us some food, and the food was really good. And it happened to be enchiladas, which is my favorite food. But I remember sitting there and not really enjoying the meal. The joy of eating my favorite food was gone. I was too overcome by the circumstances to enjoy it. You know, the fattened calf is often a picture of celebration, right? We see that in the story of the prodigal son, where the father celebrates his return by preparing a fattened calf. And so here, on this blackened day in Saul's life, he's eating a meal typically reserved for celebration. And you know, I think if you were to prepare a meal and host a king, I think this would be a good consideration for that as well. The fattened calf is a meal literally fit for a king. It's celebratory. But what joy is there to be had here? What cause of celebration? There is none, because apart from God, there is no joy. There is no celebration to be had. Saul is really no better off eating the fattened calf than he was laying on the floor. You know, it looks a little less pathetic, I suppose. But he's in no better shape eating this meal. There's a photographer named Henry Hargreaves, and he recreated the last meals of several inmates that are on death row. Now, when you look at these photographs, they really are nothing more than just plates of food. That's all they are. And yet, these photographs of these plates of food, they're described as unsettling. I think that's a good word for Saul's final meal here. It's unsettling. Verse 25 tells us that they ate, they rose, they went away into the night, and then it just ends right there. There's no happy ending here. There's no word of hope for Saul. There's no changed heart. There's no changed mind. Just a man with a seared conscience, a sealed fate, walking out into the night to face his death tomorrow. Now, like I said, it is with difficulty that we read a passage like this. It is a hard truth to look at Saul and where his life is coming to a close. And I think it becomes even more burdensome when we consider that Saul's situation is not unique. Now, the circumstances surrounding Saul are certainly unique, but the state of Saul is shared by all mankind. All men have been rejected by God. All have sinned and fall short of his glory. And therefore, apart from Christ, we are all perfectly able to relate to Saul. And so the question then is, what do we do with a passage like this? Just a couple of quick points and then we'll close. First, it's been said by many pastors and many commentators alike that the two greatest words in all of the New Testament are found in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 4, when Paul declares, "But God." And what follows are some of the most glorious words, I think, in all of the New Testament. And you know them well, I bet. "But God, being rich in mercy because of the great love with which he loved us, even when we were dead in our trespasses, made us alive together with Christ. By grace you have been saved and raised up with him and he sealed us with him in the heavenly places in Jesus Christ, so that in the coming ages he might show the immeasurable riches of his grace in kindness towards us in Jesus Christ." But here's the thing. While those words are indeed glorious, what really elevates them all the more are the verses that precede it. Trespassers, sinners, sons of disobedience, children of wrath. I don't know about you, but when I read that, I don't exactly get this feel of, I'm better than Saul. So as we look at Saul's life, it ought to remind us what Jesus saved us from, and like the prostitute in Luke chapter 7, it ought to drive us to him. Second, let's remember that we have friends, families, neighbors, and coworkers who are walking Saul's path. It rarely manifests itself as vividly as it does here with Saul, but it's the same path. One day, they are going to eat their last meal, and then they are going to walk into darkness. That should be unsettling. That should drive us in our boldness to proclaim the gospel. And so my prayer this evening is, as Christians, when we look at the final days of Saul, we would do those two things, that it would first drive us to Christ, and then it would drive us to the lost who are in need of a Savior. There's one last point, though, because there might be someone in here living in rejection. There might be someone in here that's numb to God's word. You're living your life how you want to live it, probably thinking that you've got some time. But I promise you that you'll find no joy. You're going to find no real satisfaction apart from Christ Jesus. So to you, I would just repeat the pleas of the writer of Hebrews. Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. Let's pray. Father, it's hard to open up a passage and to look at judgment and sin, to weigh the cost of a life lived in rejection. But Father, it drives me to a love for you. It makes me want to seek you more, knowing that this is what you saved me from. I pray that as we open up hard to read passages, that it would grow us in love for you, that it would soften our hearts for the lost. And that it would drive us to seek righteousness. Lord, we love you. We thank you for your Son, Christ Jesus. I thank you for the gift of salvation through the cross. I just pray that we would cherish it all the more today. It's through his name that we pray. Amen.